Killing people is fun, isn't it? It feels great when you pull off a good death scene. People cry, you're a good writer because you made people feel something, which, you know, is hard these days. So I've been studying 19 death scenes by brilliant authors across multiple genres, why they work, and what specific techniques we can learn from them. And I got in an expert.
Hi, I'm Sean Bean.
And I'll even show you a death scene that I wrote. They're gonna hate it. Oh no, it's terrible. Oh my god, what if I'm a failure? And because I don't want you mad at me, spoilers, okay? For all of these things, we're talking character deaths. You've been warned. This type of video takes a lot of time for me to read, study, and write. So thanks to the writing and world-building program Campfire for sponsoring the video and helping make it possible. And you know what? You can help the channel and get 20% off. That's right, 20% off with my code down below. And my last video like this on writing character descriptions, gotta be honest, started out really terribly. But once people started commenting, liking, sharing, etc., it literally saved the video. I hate to be that guy, but it really does help. Part 1. The language you use matters. Now, you already know that if the reader is invested in a character, it's gonna hurt when they die, no matter how. Except, get readers invested in your character isn't that helpful advice. That's kind of all of writing, isn't it? But what you focus on and your word choice when describing them dying will create different feelings for the reader. Focusing on visceral bodily descriptors like the snap of bones breaking and specific bodily trauma creates fear and horror in the reader. Unsurprisingly, it's a hallmark of Stephen King's writing.
And then, as he entered the zone of broken glass, he felt her hand close around his left ankle and squeeze his stump excruciatingly. He screamed. One of his elbows came down on a hook of glass and it jabbed up into his arm. He crawled forward anyway, with it sticking out of him like a pushpin. He turned back again, and yes, her face had gone black, a dusky, rotted plum black from which her bleeding eyes bulged wildly. The pressure slackened. For a moment, he could breathe again. Then Annie collapsed on top of him, a mountain of slack flesh, and he couldn't breathe at all.
King's focus is on these clear, instinctual descriptions of injuries and pain that create this claustrophobic feeling with a real threat of harm that we can understand very physically, to the point that we're left with a sigh of relief when it's over. And we can contrast this with how Philip Pullman describes Lee Scoresby's death in His Dark Materials.
Another crack, and this time the bullet went deep somewhere inside, seeking out the center of his life. He thought, it won't find it there. Hester's my center. Lee found it hard to pull the trigger. Everything was hard. Then, she was pressing her little proud, broken self against his face, as close as she could get. And then they died.
The language here talks about pain and death in the abstract, rather than attaching it to visceral bodily descriptors like King, where Pullman uses metaphors and similes to abstract us from the pain of death, focusing instead on the love that he and his daemon Hester shared. King's only poetics only bring us closer to the painful and uncomfortable experience with words like slack flesh. The word choice in The Subtle Knife helps the reader feel sorrow and loss, not uncomfortable or horrified the way King wants us to feel. He could have described the intense agony of having a bullet inside you, but he doesn't. Consider where the words put the focus in the description of your death scene, and also how abstracted the reader is from the character's pain and suffering. But this is also why you've got to think really carefully about Part 2. How you introduce the death. So I read British Terabithia when I was like 10, a great age to read a book like that. And it's about two kids who bond over an imaginary magical land together. Who would have guessed I'd love it? And the ending is really tight, like a rope that will never snap. Both it and John Green's Looking for Alaska are books that deal with the unfair suddenness of death, with denial and unresolved grief. And they do it in similar ways. So let's look at how they introduce the death to do that.
He watched the car go out of sight, the joy giggling inside of him so hard that he wouldn't have been surprised if his feet had just taken off from the ground the way they sometimes did in dreams and floated him right over the roof. He was all the way into the kitchen before he realized that something was wrong. His dad's pickup hadn't been outside the door, but he hadn't taken it in until he came into the room and found them all sitting there. His parents and the little girls at the kitchen table, and Ellie and Brenda on the couch. Not eating. There was no food on the table. Not watching TV. It wasn't even turned on. He stood unmoving for a second while they stared at him. Suddenly, His mother let out a great, shuddering sob. "Oh my God, oh my God." She said it over and over, her head down on her arms. His father moved to put his arm around her awkwardly, but he didn't take his eyes off Jess. "I told you, he just gone off somewhere," Maybelle said quietly and stubbornly, as though she had repeated it often and no one had believed her. Brenda's pouting voice broke in. "Your girlfriend's dead, and Mama thought you was dead too."
She just kills a kid. Like that. My crush when I was 10, just gone. Dead. I'm fine. Great book.
Firstly, there's no explanation or gradually leaning into the death, it's just, your girlfriend's dead. Very suddenly in the sentence, almost unkindly suddenly. They phrase it in this cold and very factual way. Secondly, they both offer the reader an alternative explanation for why everyone is looking so worried to lure the reader into a false sense of security before revealing the truth. This gives us momentary relief, hope, which then makes the reveal all the more shocking and sharper. Thirdly, they both put it at a point in the narrative structure where the reader has kind of been promised that their character still has stuff to do, and at a point that we don't usually expect this kind of death.
They also both purposely place the death off screen to work against that assumption that we'll be able to be there to have a proper goodbye, to deprive us of that catharsis. Especially because in fiction we have this underlying logic that if a main character dies, then we'll be there to see it. But we aren't.
But death does not wait. It also sets the story up to explore feelings of denial and dread leading up to the reveal as the clues slowly stack up for us, and the guilt of not being there for them after. These may be feelings that you want the reader to have, and these can help you do that. Off-screen deaths can also happen for other reasons too, suspense, or it's inappropriate for your style or genre or age group, or you want their final moment to be something else perhaps. Maybe a father is on a trip with his son in the Arctic and they're running out of food, and to ensure his son survives, he goes out into the cold to die. The important moment here is the goodbye and not the death. The son not seeing the death is even important. In contrast, we can look at how the death of the 10th Doctor from Doctor Who is introduced to us.
Which I have not, and will not get over, because we all damn well know it peaked with him. If you disagree with me, feel free to tell me why you're wrong in the comments.
10's death is introduced very gradually. We can see it coming for a long time, and it's 20 minutes from knowing he will die to dead. It's not a gruesome slog of him bleeding out on the ground either.
The writer didn't want to create the feelings of horror and fear like Stephen King, or shock and loss like Bridge to Terabithia or Looking for Alaska.
He wanted us to feel the sorrow that comes from the inevitability of knowing your death is coming and not being able to stop it, culminating in this final moment.
I don't want to go.
This is a feeling a lot of stories about terminally ill characters try to create in the reader, and in both cases, that time before the death is really important to fostering that feeling.
But sometimes character deaths can be dragged out to help the reader come to terms with their death, accept it, eventually move on with this bittersweet ending.
Gladiator ends with the death of Maximus, and you can see it coming for a long time with him seeing his family in the afterlife in these flashes. Where Bridge to Terabithia's suddenness feels horrible because there was never any chance to say goodbye or come to terms with it, by the time Maximus actually dies, there's this catharsis for the viewer that he's finally at rest, especially because those last moments are spent killing the antagonist. His whole story is tied up for us. There's also no sudden tonal shift in this moment either, like there are in the stories of Looking for Alaska and Bridge to Terabithia, because the writers wanted the death to feel like a natural passage for the character and this story. We are being told to let him go. It's not jarring in any way, it's just the next step. You as the author can use a drawn-out death scene to make it easier or harder to accept the death by guiding the reader with how the characters are reacting to it. In stories about how to face death for both the reader and character, that time before death is precious.
But as I studied these, I realized that basically all of them use this literary technique to heighten the emotions of their death scenes. They use
Part 3. Juxtaposition.
Placing two contrasting things right next to one another to elevate their differences.
Bridge to Terabithia makes a point of describing just how happy Jess is. Things are going great, right before he learns of Leslie's death. And similarly, looking for Alaska has Miles ecstatic, thinking about how he's just begun to kiss Alaska, this girl of his dreams. All to make that sudden tonal drop more drastic and the pain more sudden, because there's this whiplash against that recently uplifting emotion.
I want to show you how it's used in this really sweet short story called Two Robots at the End of the World, which is about two robots at the end of the world, called Motherboard and Toaster.
A burning tide was washing over the horizon. It glittered with memory, its many arms propping itself up on the mountain tops. 4%. Toaster had seen many images of humans watching the sunrise and sunset. One of them had always rested their head on the shoulder of the other. He had no head, and Motherboard had no shoulder, but he wheeled himself up onto the rock at her level and tipped his optic screen onto her bonnet. It was growing colder. "Remember to keep your solar plates open, Toaster," she said, her audio chip fuzzing out on the last few words. Clinging to the sunrise, Motherboard used what little power she had left to sear the fire and bronze display onto her optics. It was the last thing she would ever see. A sunrise that would stay with her forever. Crystallized, not bent or refracted, every strand captured perfectly. Her optics dipped. "Motherboard?" said Toaster. But he was alone.
And that was written by me, actually. I didn't want to shape your expectations of it by telling you first.
Juxtaposing Motherboard's death with a beautiful sunrise just serves to emphasize the grim reality of her death in a way that simply describing how horrible and dark and fearful and painful it is now would not. Juxtaposition like this also complicates your prose in a death scene. Beauty in dark times can hold a lot of meaning for characters and the reader, like it does for Toaster here. It's intentionally bittersweet, and it's something Motherboard always wanted to see. But Gladiator, on the other hand, actually uses juxtaposition to help us come to terms with Maximus's death, and let him go. The final scenes flick and contrast between the bloody, dry arena and the beautiful, tranquil fields of the afterlife. The beauty of the next life only makes the bloody reality of this one worse. As the scene goes on, you want him to move on to this beautiful place, until he does, and it feels right.
So the question is, what small thing could you juxtapose the death against in your prose to enhance the emotions or atmosphere that you want your reader to feel? Death scenes mean you're handling a lot of complicated emotions. You really want the reader to feel something, and when you want that, it can be really easy to fall into
Part 4. Melodrama!
This is funny. This is not. This funny. This not. Funny not. When you really want the reader to feel something, there's this very real temptation to just ramp up the intensity and displays of emotion, falling to their knees, crying to the heavens, fainting in shock, going I have been guilty of this, and chances are so have you, and it's especially tempting when killing a character. We want readers to feel things, but melodrama isn't that great these days. Melodrama strips a scene of subtext,
which is when there's information not explicitly said, but it plays into the scene. Depth, in other words. Look what's being felt and explored, but isn't being said aloud in the scene. It's also just not convincing for characters to be over-dramatic in these ways, which can at worst make it funny in your most emotional moments, but it's also just not that immersive because we're being told how to feel rather than just letting ourselves feel the moment as it is.
The reality is, humans will often have a lot going on inside their head, even if it doesn't come out in these big displays, physically or vocally.
This simple handshake between John Coffey and Paul Edgecombe as he puts this innocent man to death is a hell of a lot more meaningful to me than... Even though the handshake is very underplayed, restraint and what we don't say are also fantastic indications of emotions and character.
So, are you being melodramatic with your death scene? Well, I think there are 4 main red flags that are easy to look out for.
1. Characters are expressing emotions disproportionate to their death or to how they would usually express themselves, especially physically. It's out of character, but the story treats it as totally authentic. 2. Characters are expressing everything that they're feeling vocally. Stay with me! Oh, it's getting dark! Cliches often come to mind about this. 3. Characters are describing just how freaking intense an emotion is, rather than what it means for them, or describing how they're reacting. And 4. Excessive use of metaphors or extended metaphors to describe the feelings.
And cheers to Shailene Bishop, Faye Onyx, and Chris Winkle, who pointed out the last couple of those that I hadn't thought of.
And for a great example, let's return to the instant classic 50 Shades of Grey.
The pain is indescribable, physical, mental, metaphysical. It is everywhere, seeping into the marrow of my bones. Grief. This is grief, and I brought it on myself. Deep down, a nasty, unbidden thought comes from my inner goddess. Her lips contorted in a snarl. The physical pain from the bite of a belt is nothing compared to this devastation.
Existential pain or relief or loss after someone's death is a thing, but people don't tend to think of it in these abstract ways, but in how we can't get out of bed, how we feel nothing when we're doing something we would usually love, how we can't focus on damn well anything! I'm not saying using metaphors to describe emotions is melodramatic on its own, it's not. But having them dominate how a character expresses their emotions, especially metaphors that are esoteric and heady and philosophical, can make a death feel like it's not really happening in or affecting reality.
We can immediately contrast this to Miles' reaction to Alaska's death in Looking for Alaska.
Gasping, vomiting over and over again, wanting to melt into the brown, crunchy grass, a dull, endless pain in my gut that wouldn't go away even when I knelt on the stingingly frozen tile of the bathroom, dry heaving. Very little is abstract here, and even when it is, it's all grounded in very relatable actions and decisions. This is where you need to listen to beta readers. If they tell you it's melodramatic, it's probably because it's coming across that way. But it also may mean that you haven't built up the important story beats the way that you think, and so readers might just not be convinced of the intensity of these emotions yet. And that's because as authors, it is very easy for us to feel what we think people should be feeling when we're reading our own writing.
But I also found that the most heart-wrenching deaths for me went even further than this, because they, part 5, leave the character with something unfinished. A goal they haven't reached, a conversation they need to have, a place they need to see, an arc they haven't finished, something important they need to do, and it especially hurts if they're really close to it. This does 2 things.
1, it's hard to come to terms with their death when we don't get the catharsis we feel we deserve, when their subplots and arcs aren't neatly tied up yet. And 2, it makes it more unexpected for the same reasons. We kind of expect everything to be tied up before a character can die. Jon Snow's death in George R. Martin's A Dance with Dragons hit when it came out because Jon still hadn't learned the truth of his parents, beaten the others, or fully earned the loyalty of the Night's Watch as leader. John Green captures this feeling quite nicely in Alaska's unexplored relationship with Miles as he thinks, "Don't, I have just begun to kiss her." In Bridge to Terabithia, they still have to save the imaginary kingdom together when she dies. The 10th Doctor's whole thing was that he felt like he could do so much more if he didn't die.
I consistently found that the most painful deaths for me left me with these unresolved feelings of something left unfinished that deprived me of the catharsis I thought the character deserved and I deserved. We talked before about sudden versus expected deaths, and leaving something unfinished can really help capture that sense of the suddenness of death. That death doesn't wait for us to tie up all of our plot lines.
On the other hand, you could complicate the reader's feelings about a character's death by having them willing to die, but some things are still unfinished. The reader can feel that catharsis, but there's also that element of unfairness. Snape kind of fits into this. He dies in the Deathly Hallows knowing he is protecting Harry, and that Harry knows that he was protecting him. But he never gets to see Voldemort's fall, a final revenge for Lily that he always wanted. But at the same time, we kinda love stories where characters are finished before they die, like in Gladiator. We like fiction with that kind of security, that nice ending in a way. It's part of that escapism, even if it's heartbreaking in a different way. It's sad because they're dying, yeah, but it's also a happy ending in a twisted way because we don't have this unresolved tension with them. Especially if they chose to die heroically, sacrificing their life, it's bittersweet. It gives us hope that people can change and death won't get in the way.
I mean, is anything more of a red flag that a character is about to cark it than them going, "Ah, I'm so glad that my character arc is done. Hey, I can't wait to retire to that farm up north like we always said we would. Anyways, I'm gonna go fight the bad guys now. I'll see you in a couple of days." He's already dead.
But things don't have to be unexpected to be good, alright Game of Thrones? But it's a different experience for the reader, and you gotta know what experience you want the reader to have. Do you want them feeling unresolved, accepting it, sad but understanding, or somewhere in between?
And if you want to make it even more heartbreaking, and I mean at this point we're neck deep in depression, you can add an element of
Part 6. Injustice or unfairness.
They didn't deserve it, it's just pointless suffering, it was inevitable, they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it was at this point in writing the script that I realized that the death that impacted me the most was probably Donna Noble from Doctor Who.
Technically, she doesn't die, but she does lose all of her memories and the person she has grown to become. It's functionally death of the character we know. What made it so heartbreaking was that Donna began as someone who saw herself as worthless and unremarkable, but had grown over the story in her self-esteem to see herself as capable, someone of value. More than anyone, she deserved to keep her experiences of being with the Doctor, but she got this horrible ending.
And again, you know this is when Doctor Who peaked, this is not up for debate.
Injustice or unfairness creates a different kind of empathy in the reader, but it can also create a resentment or hatred against the character who causes their death in a way that, say, two equally skilled opponents dueling it out might not. And that might be valuable to you as a writer. Could be the spark of a vengeance quest or a descent into madness.
And that's because the truth is that death scenes aren't really just about the character that dies, they're about
Part 7. How it affects the people around them.
In both the case of something being left unfinished or injustice and unfairness, these have consequences for the remaining characters. Now, one of the pieces that you will usually come across when looking at death scenes is that deaths should have a second purpose in the narrative. And I mostly agree with this.
Unfinished plot threads are a great way to do that because the remaining characters have to deal with the holes left behind by this character. When Ned Stark died in the Game of Thrones, he had promised to tell Jon his true parentage, and Jon is left grappling with the idea that he might never know. Ned's goal was to protect his family from the Lannisters, and so that job falls to Robb Stark, who in response calls himself the King in the North. It gives narrative weight and meaningful consequences to their death rather than just being a thing that happened. It can even sometimes give catharsis in the long term as characters fill those holes left behind or get justice where the character couldn't. In Pixar's Up, Ellie Fredrickson always wanted to see Paradise Falls, but died before she ever could. So Carl does this by the end of the film, and there's a catharsis to that. Then he finally fulfilled her dream. So you can use unfinished plot threads to control the reader's experience and give the death more purpose and meaning. And that unfairness or injustice can also come from how it affects the characters around them.
Some people also say that you need to know a character really well to care about them dying, but, hot take, I don't think that's really true. A character who we don't know well dying can still mean a lot if we know what that person represents to another character.
In What Remains of Maya Sankavi by G. D'Angia, an AI is tasked to be the mother of human children on a new planet. We don't know that much about their first child, Daisy, but we do know what successfully bringing this first child into the world means to the AI.
We see Daisy's dandelion head pop up and down on the waves. She's unconscious, a small speck in a sea of rust and scarlet. We feel the heat of our components and see the warnings emerge in our field of vision. We fight against the waves, against the errors. They swallow Daisy, pull her little body under. We dive, bump into a sharp stone with our knee before our hands grab Daisy's shoulder. We lay her down, stretch her neck, give CPR, and pump air into her lungs. 3 rounds, 3 terrible new memories. Then Daisy convulses, spews out the water she swallowed. Only a little bit of dying today. We cry out, we hug her, whisper her name against her hair, tell her we love her so, so much. Stupid child, we say, but we do not mean it. Daisy shakes and we cry without tears.
Her firstborn, her purpose, everything she hopes to be. And it's unfair. It hurts when she dies later in the story. The point is, a great death scene is made by what surrounds it as well, what we can call the scaffolding of the scene. But we need to bring this back to something a lot of less experienced writers grapple with, because a lot of us just assume that death is the end goal, but the truth is, Part 8, there are fates better than death. There are so many things worse than death that can happen to your characters. I can't just default to it because I think that's the only way to move a story forward, or because I want the reader to feel loss.
When I say fate's better than death, I mean better for your story. Death is a tool, but it's not necessarily the most meaningful, most impactful, not even most painful end you can give a character.
Donna losing her memories is proof enough. It's more meaningful and more painful than simply dying, because she loses all of that character growth through no fault of her own. Only you can figure out the most meaningful end to your character's story, but there are some tools that I use to help figure these out.
Personally, I am a big fan of literary symmetry.
For example, let's contrast Ned Stark's death in A Game of Thrones with Iroh's survival in The Last Airbender. Ned Stark's death is not literary symmetry, but it was perhaps the most meaningful way to end his story. It wove into the underlying Machiavellian philosophy of the series that traditionally heroic traits are no guarantees of success, which is why Varys explains to Ned, "It was not the wine that killed the king, it was your mercy." His mercy, his virtue in the end gets him killed. And he's the perfect character to establish that anyone in this story can die. In contrast, Iroh was once a warmongering nationalist who laid siege to Ba Sing Se for the Fire Nation. Now, he could have died saving Zuko, and that would have been meaningful in its own way. But the writers chose a kind of literary symmetry by having his story culminate in him saving Ba Sing Se from the Fire Nation instead, going from warmongerer to peacekeeper. There's a literary symmetry here that gives his arc a sense of completeness, that it's come full circle.
And literary symmetry is comically common with villain deaths.
I mean, Harry survived Voldemort in the first book because of his mother's loving, willing sacrifice for him, and then in the 7th book, he's suddenly shocked that everyone is protected from Voldemort because Harry's loving, willing sacrifice for his friends.
You can draw a lot of tension from things that aren't the threat of death, so if you're looking for another more meaningful end to a character, look at their fears, their weaknesses, an end that would contrast with their arc across the story. And this is especially relevant for characters that you and the reader know will not die. You know the sort I'm talking about.
Nobody thinks the Doctor will ever permanently die. Companions, sure, they're a dime a dozen these days, but for him, it's just not on the cards. So the high points of the show for me have always been when they threaten him with fates worse than death, losing his memories, his personality, losing the people around him, losing his morality. These all take account of his deepest struggles and weaknesses and turn them on their head. Whether you want a character to meet a painful or good ending, think about literary symmetry and fates that interact with their weaknesses, strengths, their arc, and fears. Redemption arcs sometimes come up here with the now good guy sacrificing his life, and personally, I don't like that. I don't think it's really redemption to just die. Oh wow man, look at all those bad things I did, I'm carking it now, when it's much more meaningful to face up to the wrongs of your past.
But also, don't go too hard on yourself with any of this. Don't feel like you have to obey all of these esoteric writing rules. If you feel like your character's story naturally ends in death, or you just want to write their story that way, do it. It's your story. Don't listen to anyone else and you'll still make people cry. Have fun with it. I try to only take sponsors that I really do feel you guys might genuinely find helpful.
And Campfire is a really good writing and world building program to...
Okay, so I was going to do a normal sponsor section, but then I put out a tweet saying, hey, you know how when you write a name or a place or a magic system term in your book and it comes up with that little red squiggly line that says, hey, this is spelled incorrectly and you can't get rid of it and it keeps happening, you know? It gets really annoying. So I said, hey, wouldn't it be great if when you go add to dictionary, you can add your own definition and have like a glossary for all the terms you've added for that document and transplant it into other documents like other chapters as well. And I tagged Campfire saying, hey, can you do this? And they said, mission accepted. Not even kidding, 16 hours flat that added that to Campfire. That is the sort of people that we're dealing with. Not even to say all of the other features the Campfire already has, pages for writing and word building and places and magic systems, etc. I was just really impressed that they did that. So yeah, that is the sort of product that people at Campfire are making. They listen and they've done it well. So when I say that they're good, I mean it. They really do deserve the success that they're having and I can get totally behind it. and you get 20% off with my code, and you only pay what you want for what you're going to use. I really like that. And so does Momo. Do you doubt Momo? But let's bring all of this together in a thick, milky pot.
Firstly, visceral bodily descriptors can create fear and horror in a death scene, making the reader uncomfortable, while more abstract language allows us to focus on other feelings like sorrow and love rather than very real pain. Secondly, suddenly introducing death or placing it off screen helps the reader explore the unfair abruptness of death and feelings of unresolved grief. Alternative explanations can lure the reader into a false sense of security and make that reveal more impactful. Thirdly, longer death scenes can foster an exploration of powerlessness and the inevitability of death, but they can also be used to guide the reader to accepting this bittersweet ending. Fourthly, juxtaposition can add depth to your prose and make a character's death easier or harder to accept, especially if it creates tonal whiplash. Fifthly, melodrama strips a scene of subtext. It's usually less convincing and immersive, and it's often the result of trying to get a reader to feel something by ramping up the intensity of the emotions. It's often marked by disproportionate reactions, cliches, excessive metaphors, and describing feelings in the abstract. Sixthly, leaving the characters with something unfinished or making the death unjust or unfair is a great way to make a death more unexpected and deprive the reader of that catharsis. Unfinished plot threads are also a great way to give the death a second purpose. And seventhly, consider what might be the most meaningful fate for your character, taking account of their arc, their fears, their strengths, and literary symmetry.
This was a lot of fun. If you want to, share a death scene you wrote down in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Stay nerdy, guys, and I will see you in the future.